There's a moment that many people experience but rarely talk about. You try to explain how you feel. Not to complain, not to accuse, just to feel close. You speak. The other person listens. They nod. They say they understand. And still, something doesn't settle. It's not a fight. It's not a misunderstanding. Nothing dramatic happens. But you leave the conversation feeling slightly alone, as if something important stayed with you instead of between you. This happens in relationships, friendships, families, even at work. And when it does, people often question themselves quietly. Am I explaining this wrong? Am I asking for too much? Why do I still feel unseen if they heard me? There's no failure in this experience. No lack of effort. No personal flaw to fix. It's a common, subtle tension. One that lives in moments where words exist, but something else is missing. And noticing that feeling doesn't mean you're about to confront anything yet. It just means you're allowed to slow down and stay with it for a moment. Maybe what's uncomfortable in those moments isn't what was said. Sometimes the tension comes from what stays unspoken, the weight you're still holding while the conversation ends. In many situations, people focus on being understood, finding the right words, the clearest explanation, the perfect example. And that makes sense, because being understood feels like safety. But it's possible that what you're searching for isn't clarity at all. It might be the feeling that you don't have to keep translating yourself to stay connected, that you don't need to convince, that you don't need to make your inner world easier to digest. In some relationships, you can feel close without being fully understood. In others, you can be deeply understood and still feel alone. That contrast is subtle. And because it's subtle, people often miss it. They assume the problem is communication, or effort, or emotional intelligence. But maybe there's another layer here. One that isn't about explaining better, but about how connection is actually felt in the body, not just processed in words. At this point, it helps to name what's happening in a different way. In many cases, this frustration isn't really about communication. It's about how connection is being experienced. Understanding lives in meaning. Support lives in relationship. Someone can understand your words and still not be available to share the weight of what those words carry. From a psychological perspective, what's being touched here is not a lack of clarity, but a break in relational presence. When the other listens but remains distant, emotionally neutral, untouched, unchanged, the psyche registers that as separation, not connection. So the tension doesn't come from not being heard. It comes from realizing that even after speaking, you're still alone with it. In many relational histories, people learn early that staying connected requires effort. Explaining yourself, adjusting your language, making your inner world more acceptable, more understandable, more manageable for the other. Not because something is wrong with you, but because connection was never something that could be taken for granted. From a psychological view, this creates a subtle split. Part of you speaks. Part of you watches to see if the other stays. And when they don't move toward you, the frustration isn't intellectual. It's existential. It's the feeling of having to carry your inner life alone, even in company. So maybe the question isn't why this keeps happening. Maybe it's not about choosing better words, or explaining yourself more clearly, or finding the right argument that finally makes the other get it. Maybe it's about noticing what you're actually asking for. Not understanding, but presence. Not agreement, but someone who stays close to what you're carrying. Because there's a quiet difference between being listened to and not being alone inside the moment. And when that difference keeps repeating, the frustration grows. Not as anger, but as exhaustion. An exhaustion that comes from having to hold yourself together, while hoping the other will meet you there. So before asking why they don't understand, it might be worth sitting with a different question. What part of you is still waiting for someone to step closer? Not to your explanation, but to your inner weight? And how long have you been calling that distance being understood, when what you were really longing for was support?